The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 15th chapter. Listen now for what the Holy Spirit is saying to the church. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So the father divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off, and he went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. And he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to the father, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quick, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is now found. Let us celebrate.' Now, the father's elder son was in a field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on, and he replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then the elder brother became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen! For all these years I have been working like a slave for you. I have never, ever disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours.' But we had to celebrate. We had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead, and he has come to life. He was lost, and he has been found." All of this is from God, who entrusts us with the message of reconciliation. Praise be to you, Lord. This is one of those parables of Jesus that we hear over and over again. Not just every 3 years because it's an election year, but it's a favorite parable because for the history of the church, we have always gone to this parable to talk about God and God's grace and God's love, because we have traditionally interpreted this parable to that the Father is who within the big picture? God. And the Son that took everything, that took in his inheritance and went and squandered it, we typically have historically interpreted that to be us. And then that elder brother that just gets so ticked off, that is, well, some have said that it's the Pharisees and the scribes that got really angry at Jesus. Maybe that's when Jesus was really, sticking it to them, kind of trying to get them to listen. But also it's kind of us too, in the interpretation. So we have these three characters that are playing a major role in there. We have the Father, we have the younger son, and we have the elder son. And we hear their story. But there's also this story of characters that are not in the parable. For instance, what about the mother? Have you ever thought about that? What was the mother feeling? She probably had multiple children, but there's these two, and the elder son is to inherit the farm and is doing everything right. What was her feeling about the elder son? Was she all about supporting him, or did she support the younger son and in fact encourage the younger son to ask his father for his inheritance? Because these two brothers, if you go back into the book of Genesis, these two brothers are mirroring a lot of the sibling rivalry that we see within the Old Testament. What was the mother's, when the younger son came back? What was her feeling? Was it the same as the father, or did she side with the older brother? That's that's one character within that. And you might identify with that unspoken character, that character that's kind of in the backdrop of it all. And then you got those two brothers. We cannot help but be captivated by those two brothers and the strong reactions that they have. In fact, there is another character in the story that doesn't have a name. It's kind of like the mother. And this character is kind of ephemeral, doesn't have form. And this character, I think, it plays a lot also within the other stories in the Old Testament where we see the sibling rivalry, especially when we go back into the book of Genesis, and you have two characters that are like this younger brother and this older brother, and their names are Cain and Abel. Do you remember them?
Yeah.
Do you remember their story? One brother was very, very angry with the other brother. Abel was a farmer and offered up these first fruits to God. And they were well pleased. God was well pleased with them, according to the book of Genesis. And then Cain, who was the hunter, kind of like this older brother, thought he was doing everything right, made his sacrifice, and God, according to the book of Genesis, refused it. And this anger and frustration arose within Cain. And this other character that I am talking about enters the picture. This character called resentment. It's a very demonic character in a sense, because it doesn't take form. It just kind of comes into the story, and it goes within the heart of the character and plants a seed that continues to grow with the frustration that that character has, as Cain had around doing what he thought was right, to be going out and killing deer and bringing food in to the family. being a strong presence within that, and yet God did not value him. And so this resentment that Cain had grew within his heart to the moment that Cain killed Abel. And the blood poured into the earth, and Cain tried to hide it. It's your first murder mystery. And everybody was going, where's Abel? What happened to Abel? Cain, have you seen your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And yet the earth cried out, and God heard it. The same is within this story. And I believe that when Jesus was telling this story about these two brothers, that this story of Cain and Abel was kind of in the backdrop, especially those good Pharisees, those good preachers, and those scribes, those theological students, those students of the Bible. They all knew stories of brothers that are in the Bible. It's, like Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers. Jesus knew that they knew these stories. So you have this younger brother that is resentful and says, I don't want to be a farmer. I believe that there is more to life than being out here in the boondocks. And so he encourages his father to give him his inheritance. There's resentfulness within the heart of that younger son. Resentfulness towards the family. What is he resentful for? He's resentful that he is in a position that he thinks he gets something more, that there is more to life. He's resentful to his parents, to his family, and so he wants what is his, justly what is his, so that he can go and do what he wants to do. And he goes and does that. The next time we see the character resentment pop up, it is with the older brother. The older brother is resentful to the younger brother because the older brother believes that he gets what he thinks he deserves. And he is ticked off that the younger brother gets not only his inheritance, but is welcomed back into the family. This character, resentful, has been with humanity ever since the very beginning. It is something that we are always constantly struggling with. Because in our human condition, going all the way back to Cain and Abel, at some point we always feel that we have been a victim of injustice. That somebody got something that we feel that we should have gotten. And we want justice. We want revenge. We may see it as something small. It might be petty. But if we don't keep it in check, like it was for Cain, like it was for the older brother, this resentment, this thing that's planted within our hearts and our souls, it can be fed and grown with anger and frustration, and especially as we keep going through our head about how we have been wronged, how what we think that we should have gotten has been taken away from us, that the resources that we think that are scarce have been given to somebody that it doesn't deserve it. That's part of entitlement. Feeds and waters the resentment to the point that the resentment becomes a bloodlust. To the point that the resentment grows into this thorny bush that dehumanizes the one that we are putting all of our resentment towards. I mean, it could be a personal experience with a spouse, with a brother, a sister, a colleague, somebody in the parking lot at the grocery store, somebody that just takes something that you feel that should be yours, or gains something that you feel that they do not, that they just shouldn't get for one reason or another. So resentment can be towards an individual, but resentment can also just be towards a tribe, a people in general. As human beings, we love scapegoats. Especially when the resentment becomes a communal resentment towards another people. Kind of like what Jesus was pointing out with the scribes and the Pharisees. They had great resentment towards the Gentiles. They had great resentment that Jesus was actually doing stuff for the Samaritans. Hanging out with sinners, tax collectors. The Pharisees and the scribes had a bloodlust towards those who were not like them. They, with a broad brush, probably were talking a lot about all these Gentiles and what they do, that they're thieves and murderers. Don't let a Gentile sinner come into your camp. Don't let them come into your neighborhood. The moment that a Gentile moves into your neighborhood, that you need to move out. Because all they do is bring bad stuff with them. That is a resentment that has grown into a bloodlust and a bloodthirst. Resentment. We do not want to go there. Resentment of any form, either personally or collectively as a community, as a people or a tribe, we don't want that because nothing good comes from resentment. So the moment that you feel resentment bubble up, the best thing that you can do is, as my brothers and sisters down in the South in the church say, check yourself. The moment that you feel resentment and this anger and this frustration, and that you're starting to think these things like Cain was of Abel, as this elder brother was of his younger brother, when you start feeling that you should be getting something and that somebody is not deserving to receive that grace, check yourself. Pull that weed out of the garden of your heart. Confess. Say it out loud. One of the amazing things is that as we talk in the season of Lent, it's about the power of confession, to actually put whatever frustration and anger that you have about a person or a people or something like that, put that out there. Talk with somebody. Confess this frustration, this resentment that you have that is starting to sprout. Talk about it. And the moment that you do that, then you are checking your heart, pulling the weed, and opening up your eyes to see with God's eyes. Because as the Apostle Paul said in his letter, we are a new creation. When we start feeling resentment, that is the time that we go to prayer, where we do confession, where we weed out the things that divide. Our ministry is to reconciliation. We have to confess our angers and frustrations and find out why we might find resentment. And usually we're resentful because spiritually we are not God. And we're not getting what we want. God's grace is amazing. God's grace, God's love is profound. It's nothing like what we can ever dream of. Yet we can mirror the love and grace of God. Have you ever received the benefit of somebody giving you grace? Have you ever received unconditional love from somebody, even though you knew that you were in the wrong? Even though you may have been complaining and saying that you deserve something, but you didn't get it? Somebody showed you grace and pointed you in the right way. That's love. Who in your life needs to be shown grace and love? Who in your life or in your sphere of people need not resentment, but just to be embraced, for good or for bad? Just to be embraced in love. Brothers and sisters, in this season of Lent, when you start feeling that frustration, when you start feeling resentment, turn back to God. Turn back, let go, and find the love and grace, and find your way within the embrace of God, and find ways to reconcile with those that are making you frustrated and resentful. And then you will be found. All praise, honor, and glory be to you, O Christ.